All right. First of all, thank you very much for showing up. I know that all of you have choices about where you could be tonight. I know some of you are responding to your baser notions of extra credit in class. I understand that, but I'm here to tell you that despite that there is something here worthwhile for you. And that we offer this as part of an extra bit of seasoning to your college life. That there is more to the college university experience than just class. And so this is part of that. This is one of those things to expose you to some things. So I hope that you pay attention and you listen. You will have an opportunity to engage in questions and answers. And at the end of Dr. Stoner's going to talk for a little while. And then at the end of that, we're going to invite some of our professors up to the stage who will engage him in a little bit of conversation, question him on some of the things that he said, make a few comments, and then engage you in questions and answers. Because this microphone, as soon as I'm done with it, will end up down here in the audience for you to ask questions. So be thinking about this. If you've got your little notes, make notes about what your question is. You remember it when the time comes and your brain doesn't fall out on the floor. So you can just look at it. I'm Dr. Don Embody. I'm the director of the Discourse and Democracy program from the Political Science Department. And we are just thrilled to have this opportunity. Besides doing this, I teach over in the Political Science Department too. Many of you are my students, and I see a few of you out there, and I really like seeing you come back here again. The Discourse and Democracy tries to bring students in close discourse with noted authors, scholars, government officials, and other noted individuals, and the goal is to engage us in a conversation about how do you actually execute democracy in a free society? How does that actually happen? What are some of the things? Today our topic is in general free speech. Dr. Stoner will fill you in on some of those details. Tonight our guest speaker will be talking on specifically the positive freedom of speech. He'll explain what that really means in the detail. Following that, we'll have the panel up here. Our guest speaker tonight is Dr. James Stoner. Dr. Stoner is a professor in the Department of Political Science at Louisiana State University. His research interests include political theory, English common law, and American constitutionalism. He writes on common law, liberty, and origins of American constitutionalism. He's been at LSU since 1988 and has chaired the department in the past for 6 years. We're excited to have Dr. Stoner here on campus, so welcome, Dr. Stoner.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Embody. It's great to be here as part of your program. It's great to be back at Texas State University. I've lectured at universities around the country, but I especially enjoy coming back here, and it's because you have a school that's on the way up in America. And you know, how do you know? You just got here, some of you, or you've only been here for a few years, but there's something very exciting about being on a campus that's growing and developing at a university that's really taking seriously its task of educating 21st century America. So congratulations on your choice to be here, and thanks for coming tonight. In a much noted essay written in the middle of the 20th century, after the devastation of 2 horrific world wars, the British philosopher and historian of ideas, Isaiah Berlin, drew a distinction between what he called 2 concepts of liberty, one positive, one negative. Now you might think that the positive would be good and the negative bad, but Berlin was a skeptic and given to irony, so he reversed the valences. Negative liberty, by which he meant freedom from government interference, was the form of liberty he praised in the essay. Positive liberty, by contrast, was the bad, or at any rate, dangerous idea. In its name, that is, in the name of freeing men from past oppression, the totalitarian states of the 20th century had their origin, both fascist and communist, states that in practice oppressed men in the name of freeing them, or murdered them in the name of freeing others they allegedly oppressed. Without digging too deeply into Berlin's difficult essay right now, applying this distinction to freedom of speech would yield a contrast between a negative freedom of speech, a freedom from government interference with speech, the kind of free speech our Constitution is currently thought to protect, and which Berlin would presumably endorse, and positive freedom of speech. What would that positive freedom of speech be? And that's where I want to start today. The most accessible and perhaps most honest presentation of the issue of free speech in the sense of what Berlin warns against as positive liberty is Herbert Marcuse's 1965 essay called Repressive Tolerance. His argument is that tolerance of all viewpoints and expression of all opinions privileges the status quo because the individuals who speak have, without their necessarily being aware of it, had their minds formed by the dominant society, which he describes as militaristic, capitalistic, and oppressive, and thus incapable of genuine democracy or freedom. Allowing both sides to speak in such circumstances is really giving all the effective speech to one side. To quote him, the antagonistic structure of society rigs the rules of the game. Promising progress towards a humane, non-oppressive democracy as the objective truth of social relations, a Marxist trope you might recognize, though without Marx's confidence in the revolutionary working class, who have been corrupted, he thinks, but instead in academic intellectuals like himself. Marcuse advocates toleration of radical progressives, but not of conservatives. He writes, quote, suppression of regressive policies, opinions, and movements is a prerequisite for the strengthening of progressive ones. And nip them in the bud, he counsels, quoting again, withdrawal of tolerance from regressive movements before they can become active, intolerance even towards thought, opinion, and word, and finally, intolerance in the opposite direction, that is, towards the self-styled conservatives, to the political right. These anti-democratic notions respond to the actual development of democratic society, which has destroyed the basis for universal toleration. To be sure, this is censorship, even pre-censorship, he says, but openly directed against the more or less hidden censorship that pervades the so-called free media. And on it goes. As if reading from Berlin's script, he adds, quote, freedom is still to be created, even for the freest of the existing societies. True freedom, in other words, will only come about if what we call freedom is crushed. Marcuse has the virtue of frankness, writing before the emergence of modern identity politics, which, however, he might be said to have endorsed before the fact through his praise of Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. Contemporary advocates of positive liberty are usually less forthcoming about the need to repress liberal freedom, but they're anodyne-sounding alternatives. For example, the, quote, democratic speech environments praised in a recent posting by the Association of American Colleges and Universities follow the same logic, I think, though the ultimate appeal is not to purported rules of historical necessity, but sympathy for past disadvantage or guilt over past privilege. They claim to want, quote, sites of justice seeking conversation and discourse. A noble-sounding aspiration if it includes, as is said to have happened at Cephalus's house in the Piraeus a couple of millennia ago, the question of what justice is. But it's clear enough that that question is no longer on the table for these folks. Rather, everyone knows that, quote, American higher education has protected a silent power that is based on racial, class, and gender privilege, and compounded by institutional inertia, with the consequence that students aren't ready for a curriculum of, quote, Foucault, Audre Lorde, and W.E.B. Du Bois, until they have overcome their baggage of, quote, racial, class, and gender antagonisms. My point is not that these authors aren't worth reading, nor that it sometimes takes preparation for students to be able to understand difficult words. Only that indoctrination in dominant opinion is what I thought students were supposed to leave behind by going to college a college where they can encounter the full range of human thought, not what they're supposed to receive during freshman week. Quote, supporting democratic speech, this is from the report, supporting democratic speech requires faculty to move past the idea that free speech claims alone will foster a shared sense of justice. It asks faculty to attend to the changing mechanisms by which students access information, to remain open and receptive to student concerns about curricular content, and to consider adjusting classroom norms to meet student needs. For example, by developing a set of shared arrangements for classroom discussion, or by adding a reading that addresses an issue that students want to discuss, but that is indirectly connected to the course content. End quote. My translation of that passage to faculty: shut up and tell us what we want to hear. Or as students at Middlebury College, my alma mater, wrote in defense of shouting down a major speaker last spring who had come to campus to speak and be interviewed by a liberal professor whom they actually injured in a ruckus afterwards. If racist stuff, they didn't use the word stuff, if racist stuff comes up, rational debate cannot dismantle it or effectively combat its growing power. The idea that bigotry will collapse under academia's enlightened rationality is false. We must name it, bigotry, and deprive it of power. But how would they know what would come up if they didn't allow the speaker, Charles Murray, even to begin? And how would they know that reason was powerless if they wouldn't even give it a chance? Next to Marcuse and his contemporary epigones, the Supreme Court's law of free speech seems a welcome contrast. The development of free speech libertarianism, the negative liberty of speech, was a project of the court in the 20th century, beginning haltingly but developing boldly since the 1960s, so that now it counts among its champions many of the reputed conservatives on the court. The old law of free speech, constitutional and common, that is to say the 18th, 19th century law, drew a sharp line between speech and action, protecting only the former under freedom of speech and press, and limiting protections, even of those, to speech and writing that did not have a tendency to lead to illegal deeds. The key opinion in the change was Justice Louis Brandeis's concurrence in Whitney v. California in 1927, suggesting the standard that was eventually adopted by the court 40 years later, that speech should be protected unless there is advocacy of violence and an imminent danger that it will occur. Meanwhile, though that standard dealt specifically with political speech, other kinds of expression that were once thought harmful, libel, obscenity, and fighting words, increasingly were given court protection by severely narrowing the definition of those terms. Libel no longer requires evidence of truth told with good motives for a claim to be quashed. That's how Alexander Hamilton had defined the term. Public figures now can be defamed unless they can show that the speaker said something he knew was false or showed reckless disregard for the truth. Obscenity, as the court understands it, now applies only to hardcore pornography, and society seems not to be inclined to prosecute even this unless children are involved. Fighting words can only be punished if they're forbidden equally on all sides. And symbolic expression, from nasty t-shirts to burning flags, now counts as speech exonerated by the court. In a recent case, the Supreme Court upheld, with all the rhetoric of constitutional freedom, the right of the so-called Westboro Baptist Church to denounce the military, the country, homosexuals, and the Catholic Church near the Catholic funeral of a fallen soldier who was not himself gay. And they upheld that right against a lawsuit for intentional infliction of emotional harm by the father. Meanwhile, the internet is notoriously a place for unrestrained insult, thanks in part to court opinions, except when popular outcry leads popular websites to censor selectively the enemies of the day. Can limits be placed on free speech? That's my next topic. Or should they? Frankly, I find both the positive and negative liberty of speech inadequate. I consider myself a friend of free speech, but I want to take the position that there are legitimate limits on freedom of speech, beyond what the courts now recognize or enforce. I take this position precisely for the sake of freedom of speech, to make it attractive to good men and women who believe in honesty, courage, justice, civility, and other virtues, as well as in love and friendship, in family and property, in civil society, and in many other good things that we seek or enjoy in life. Freedom of speech, I think, must again be distinguished from licentious speech, Although today, that distinction, which was well known at the time of the American founding and the writing of the Bill of Rights, that distinction is largely lost. Our current crisis of free speech, I think, comes in part from our failure to understand what free speech is or ought to be, and from haphazard attempts to strike back at the excesses of licentious speech, which damage indiscriminately the good and the nefarious. To bring order to our thinking, I want to suggest 3 ends or purposes of free speech, and then relate to each end the limits on free speech that are inherent in the purpose. These ends overlap, as you'll see, and so do the norms that ought to govern free speech in their context. The first purpose of free speech, presented in the classic defenses of free speech by John Milton and John Stuart Mill, is that freedom of speech is essential if human beings are to learn and know the truth. By this they mean the truth about all things, addressing great and perennial questions about the nature of the universe, about human flourishing, about God, about justice, about risk, as well as more particular truths about day-to-day life, such as about the character of those in authority, or the guilt of someone accused of a crime. Famously or notoriously, human opinions about all of these things differ, sometimes dramatically. And these opinions are not only the idle speculations of an evening by the fire or an hour on the internet, but form the basis for organizing societies and conducting their affairs. Naturally enough, in the midst of action based on one's opinion, one rarely has either the time or the inclination to listen to its opposite. But we praise freedom of speech because it reminds us that we're not omniscient and may be mistaken in what we say and do. That there is another side to most positions that we take, and that having the courage to raise objections and the wisdom to listen to them when raised by others is a mark of intelligence and prudence. Philosophy proceeds dialectically. This has been known at least since the time of Socrates. That means through back and forth opposition. And science proceeds through the rigorous comparison of hypothesis and results. Trials in court depend on an adversarial system in which advocates on both sides of a dispute take turns. Public debates thrive on the lively presentation of partisan opinions. And all of this is not because we assume that there is no truth to be uncovered, that everything is just a matter of perspective, but because the way to truth is through critical engagement, or at least that is required to test the truth of a proposition, however it might have first been conceived. If getting at the truth is the first purpose of free speech, a limit on speaking emerges directly from it. Namely, it's wrong to lie. That is to say an untruth deliberately. Of course, if truth were easy to grasp, untruths would be easy to detect, and neither is the case. All the time, people make false statements, thinking that they're true. And the history even of philosophy and science, not to mention politics and love, is filled with error. Error in itself may have no rights, but the friend of free speech allows ample latitude for the sincere, if mistaken, expression of belief. Still, this is a matter of prudence rather than of right, I think, for generally no one has the right to tell a deliberate falsehood as though it were authentic truth. The law cannot punish all lying, at least without doubling the number of lies. You lie, says the accuser. No, I don't, replies the liar. Therefore, lying twice. But in some circumstances, for example, lying under an oath in court, the law does indeed step in. We don't expect the law to adjudicate untruth in philosophy or science, but here too, making due allowance for matters of uncertainty, we insist on academic honesty, which a claim of academic freedom cannot overrule. In short, we tolerate a lot of error when we allow freedom of speech. But error's only claim to respect comes from its ability to point us towards what's true. A second purpose of free speech is to allow for self-government. A monarch or a small junto might be able to rule without public speaking, but in a republic or a democracy, deliberation takes place openly. And every citizen knows that to make a good choice, you ought to hear both sides in any debate. What I said before about getting at the truth applies as well to discerning what is good. It's important to hear arguments for and against any public action that's proposed. Indeed, to hear all sorts of views about what ought to be on the public agenda. Corresponding to this purpose, the next inherent limit on speech comes from the need for rules of order in political debate, which restricts speech in small particulars in order to further speech as a whole. Even our program this evening, for example, though academic rather than political, is highly structured, with my giving a lecture to start, then getting responses from the panelists. They will appear, I've been promised, and then getting responses from them, and then opening the floor to questions. A better conversation about these things might be more Socratic, back and forth as the argument leads. If you're able to challenge me as soon as I say something that's wrong or unclear. But our host wants to make sure that in a public setting with a large audience like this, my position's heard and then criticized, and then that you have a chance to subject it to further scrutiny. Different settings commend different rules. Some for the legislative chamber, others for the college lecture hall, others for the courtroom, still others for a public forum or on the public streets. Without rules of order, speech is often just noise, expressing passion perhaps, but not offering reasons, staking out positions, but not aiming at understanding. There's a place for passion, for positioning, even for protest in self-government, maybe even in the academy. But it's only provisional or initial, the beginning point of an argument, bringing something neglected to the attention of the complacent. If it persists and does not take the next step towards genuine engagement, following the rules of some forum, it's more likely to suppress speech than to promote it, as has recently been seen on college campuses such as Middlebury, as I mentioned before. There's a third end of free speech, or maybe I should now say free expression. The freedom for the individual, by himself or with others, in association with others, to express his individuality and to make a distinctive contribution to society, whether to culture, to the economy, or simply to his neighbor and friends, if he chooses. Timothy Garton Ash, in his important and comprehensive recent book, Free Speech, 10 Principles for a Connected World, places this purpose first, at least as regards individuals, and then adds as a fourth purpose the expression of diversity in groups. But I find it more accurate historically and more sound anthropologically to begin with the purposes of truth-seeking and Republican governance, and then to add the distinctively modern aim of self-development, whether pursued individually or in groups. Here, the corresponding limits would be those that are anchored in justice. No one's right to express his personality ought unjustly to impinge on another's ability to do the same. I want to note 4 of these sorts of limits. First, speech can sometimes threaten or assault another person, and in such a situation, I think it has no rights to claim protection as freedom of speech. I have in mind, for example, a white person's disdainfully calling an African American by the N-word to his face. And there are other examples, even in our crude age, where you might agree that a person struck with an epithet ought to be able to reply as he would to a punch, following the old Supreme Court doctrine of fighting words. I don't mean here to endorse a general power to take offense at other statements, much less complaints that shut down an academic or political debate of sensitive topics that touch close to people's sense of themselves and what really matters. For instance, on topics of race and ethnicity, sexuality, religion, and the like. That's all critical, of course, to genuine freedom of speech, that these things be debated. Still, sensible people can distinguish between the expression of a general opinion, which might, even if it's based in prejudice, the area of which freedom of speech would permit, and something said for no other purpose than to be threatening or cruel. Frankly, I'd be happy to ban the N-word and the F-word from campus, their use perhaps to be punished with a fine. Someone has said that would raise a lot of money, at least for the latter. And especially banning the latter, the F-word, might give students, not to mention faculty, an incentive to develop their vocabularies and to learn to express their complaints with precision and wit. The second legitimate limit on free speech for the sake of justice concerns speech that does real, often measurable harm by itself. Here I have in mind defamatory speech, slander or libel. that falsely attributes to others some fault or wrong that damages or destroys their reputation. If a usually credible source falsely accuses a restaurant of harboring rats on their kitchen surfaces or serving them in their gumbo, it can destroy the owner's livelihood and that of his chef and staff. Falsely accusing an athlete of cheating can ruin his career, not to mention his lucrative endorsements. Falsely accusing an author of plagiarism can do the same, and so forth, through all the trades and professions. Not even to mention reputation for chastity or virtue among those who care about such things. Into this category of causing harm by speech belongs fraudulent speech in sales and contracts, which the law rightly punishes and sometimes guards against. Of course, here too, as in the case of the pursuit of truth generally, we rightly want to allow speech some latitude, and custom might often be a better regulator than coercive law. Even the old law rightly allowed ample room for comment on public figures. And as customers, we learned not to take seriously claims about, quote, the greatest show on earth. See how that worked out for it in the long run. Or, quote, new and improved. Still, libel and fraud are serious matters that can do serious injustice by speech alone. A third sort of injustice involves speech or expression that insinuates evil into its hearers or watchers unawares, or maybe with their invitation, but with effects on third parties that can be seriously unjust. I have in mind, for example, pornography, particularly insofar as it's available to the young or the unsuspecting, or available in more extreme versions to the weak who lack self-control. I think the evidence is pretty clear, and better explained than ever through modern neuroscience, that pornography can be addictive and do damage to people's sexual health, affecting and sometimes destroying their marriages or crippling their ability to form healthy relationships. Likewise, I think that obscenely violent video games will be discovered to have similar effects on people's character, again, particularly in the young, and that it was probably irresponsible for the Supreme Court to discard on free speech principles a California statute the other year that sought to restrict their sale to minors. Naturally, the question of what the law can achieve regarding any potentially addictive substance is a complex one. And while I doubt that any good use of such materials is impossible, I realize that there are some who think there is a good use for them, and that in the context of widespread disagreement, it may be prudent to minimize restriction and leave the matter to private choice. Still, my point here is that, at least in principle, freedom of speech ought not to be invoked to defend expression that undermines the psychological prerequisites for freedom of thought and action and the moral character of free souls. Finally, freedom of speech finds a limit in the imperative to protect individual privacy. There are things about us that no one, or at any rate not just anyone, has a right to know, and if they are learned, that no one has a right to broadcast. The modern self needs to protect its privacy every bit as much as it needs to express itself. I suppose that if men were angels or philosophers, as Madison said, this would not be a consideration. We could all live with the whole truth about ourselves being known by others, and we would not judge others harshly for their weaknesses or flaws. But because we are flawed beings, some of you will know that by the theological term sinners, we could not preserve our dignity around one another if we could not keep certain things from public view. For example, our medical history, or childhood foibles, not to mention our private thoughts or unguarded slips of the tongue. Naturally, there are times when privacy might be compromised by other imperatives. It's often thought that people who stand for office sacrifice some privacy, as voters might claim a right to know about their health or their personal histories, about their failings or their wealth. Still, in a free society, we often respect individual privacy beyond what strict justice might demand, perhaps for the sake of giving someone a second chance in life, a fresh beginning. Privacy admits there are certain truths that everyone does not have a right to know. So these are the limits I would note on freedom of speech, or rather on licentious speech, for the sake of what I want to call true freedom of speech. The limits demanded by the search for truth against the right to lie. The limits required for self-government against disorder and disruption. And the limits demanded by justice for individuals against assault, against libel and fraud, against insinuating evil, and against invasion of privacy. Taken together, I think, they would help us become a little better than we are. Now, I want to turn to the positive reasons that freedom of speech and vigorous debate ought to be not just protected, but encouraged. Our crisis in free speech today is not only that we sometimes allow speech that is undeserving of protection, or fail to protect speech that is deserving, but that we fail to summon and encourage the speech that we really need. This is true, I think, both in civic life and in the university. And the failings of each are bleeding over into the other. In civic life, the fever pitch of partisan rancor is such that it appears to be difficult for Republicans and Democrats to speak productively to one another. Even across the aisle in legislative chambers where individuals have known one another for years. We hear repeatedly on one side that the president has poisoned debate, littering the airwaves and cyberspace with false facts and a culture of bullying and insult, not least by his use of social media. On the other side, it seems clear that Mr. Trump was elevated as a spokesman precisely in response to a false propriety that pervades its own opinion as orthodoxy, whether in the account of contemporary events or in his establishment of a new morality that dismisses traditional notions of right and wrong, of goodness and badness, even of beauty and ugliness, is hopelessly unenlightened, and denounces those who hold them as bigots. Here, it's not exactly that each side does not know what the other thinks. Indeed, each side is confident that it's heard more than enough from the other. But each would be hard-pressed, I think, to explain how any sensible person can see things another way from the way that they do. And that, I think, might be the key to making progress towards restoring a civil conversation. If each side would try honestly to see how the other side sees things, what he or she fears, and hopes, knows and believes, not supposing at the outset that their opponents are simply deluded or irrational, but that they just might have a point. This means that the Trump supporter ought to consider what it's like for the Hispanic American to hear about building a wall on the southern border, not just the one, the Latino who's here illegally, although what sympathy might extend to them too, but someone of Mexican or Central American descent who holds a green card or is even a citizen. What's it like for an African American who feels he's not only lost a friendly and understanding compatriot in the White House in the last election, but that that mindset has been repudiated and replaced with its hostile opposite? What of the Muslim American who sees in the president's travel ban not a measure to protect against terrorism, but an insult against his faith and a repudiation by his fellow citizens? What of the liberal progressive whose whole understanding of the arc of history has been disrupted and whose favored policies are not only suspended, but starting to be reversed? But on the other side, can the liberal understand the Christian who sees the social agenda pushed upon the country by liberal professors, the liberal media, the federal bureaucracy, and the federal courts, often without allowing him his democratic right to vote, who sees this as an assault upon all that's right and good and pure, whose communities are increasingly forbidden from publicly affirming shared beliefs and promoting them by law, where they cannot form the common culture that promotes trust and enables friendship? What of those who, through no fault of their own, are not members of minorities singled out for special advantages? Some perhaps even members of ethnic and religious minorities themselves, who've worked hard for their success and are now told they don't deserve their rewards? What more generally of the law-abiding and the thick-skinned, who do their duty as they see it without complaint, when they seem to see all public benefits go to those who shirk and shriek? And what of those who, in a time of economic insecurity and increasing inequality, lurch between demanding opportunity to work and earn and demanding government protection and munificence for the needs they cannot meet on their own? That troubled working class that determines elections these days, according to which way they lean. Now, I've tried to express these viewpoints of the two sides sympathetically, and if you thought I favored one or the other, either I failed in my intention, or perhaps you heard through partisan ears. I don't fault you for that, if it's so, because partisanship is natural. But I only suggest that trying to figure out what others' interests and opinions and even passions are, is the beginning of that mutual understanding which makes it possible, politically, to work together where those interests and opinions overlap, and not allow differences, even on deeply important matters, to blind us to the interests that we share. Part of the genius of our federal system is that we're called to address our common interests on different levels, where many distinctions lose their relevance, and where immediate common concerns are evident to all. My point about free speech in the civic realm is not that it is absent right now, or even inhibited, but that there is a dearth of listening, perhaps on both sides, to each other. Yes, failure to listen to be promoted by politicians who seek electoral advantage by appealing to the most active and often most extreme among their fellow partisans. But voters have the means of rewarding and punishing ideological extremism. And arguably, in the last election, they did just that. The Supreme Court, in the case of New York Times v. Sullivan, spoke of an ideal of public speech as robust and uninhibited. But sometimes I think speech is more robust and more effective if it is inhibited by a hesitancy to insult the opposition, to distort one's opponent's ideas and deride their characters, to suppose their bad faith. It certainly is easier to listen to the other side, in my experience, if it expresses itself with restraint. Turning now to the situation in the universities, and I'll end here, I think something different is at issue, at least deep down. Let me introduce this final part of my argument with an image. Suppose you could only see a part of the visual spectrum of colors, say from purple through shades of blue and green, all the way to green. It's not that hard to imagine. One can look through colored glasses and more or less see the world that way. And we know that there's light outside our normal spectrum, infrared or ultraviolet, that we can't see. Now, suppose that into this cool world of blues and greens and purples, there suddenly entered orange. Wouldn't we be as startled as a deer who suddenly confronts a camouflaged hunter? The deer can't see orange, right? That's why the hunters wear them, so they can see each other. Perhaps the sight would be painful. Maybe some viewers would be curious, but wouldn't more seek to avoid it, to flee, to suppress it, or blot it out, or maybe deny it even exists. It wouldn't be a color after all, some theoretician might say, but an assault upon true color. It might be dismissed as just a disturbance of the eyes. Well, what I want to suggest is that increasingly in the humanities and the social sciences at most universities, and certainly at most liberal arts colleges, though not necessarily at your school here, the spectrum of views expressed on the faculty is as narrow as my imagined spectrum of colors. Students at those schools, at least, rarely encounter professors who would describe themselves as conservative. And even professors who identify as conservative shield their beliefs or bend over backwards to avoid their expression in the classroom or in public. Look at a discipline like sociology, where students take courses on the family, and you'll find that with only a few exceptions, the emphasis is on alternative family relationships or criticism of traditional family roles, with studies that find evidence in favor of traditional arrangements roundly reviewed. I have in mind the experience of sociologist Mark Regnerus up at the University of Texas in Austin. Look at history, where structures of exclusion and oppression are discovered and documented, but explanation of achievement and success is reserved usually for popular histories, not academic works. Look at law, where tenure is awarded for lengthy articles promoting novel ways of turning legal precedents toward progressive causes, and traditional laws assumed to be deeply biased. Look even at medicine, where the Hippocratic Oath has to be modified or ignored. As on the frontiers, medicine is no longer just the cure or management of disease, but the redesign of the human body according to the wishes of its inhabitant, and even the elimination of bodies that are incapable of autonomy. Now, let me be clear. I don't mean that there isn't validity to modern studies, and that some of them are not very well done. For example, there's a recent book by historian Eric Yellen about Woodrow Wilson's imposition of segregation on the federal civil service in the early part of the 20th century, after an integrated civil service was developed for Reconstruction, and in the several decades after that. And his uncovering of the demotions and indignities of a rising black middle class, in that book is eye-opening and greatly complicates the story of progressivism in the 20th century. Woodrow Wilson was a great progressive. Nor do I mean to question the sincerity of many liberal academics who are not at all Marcusian Marxists and who honestly teach the truth as they see it to their students and even believe it's their duty to address social injustice and urge their students to do the same. My point is simply that because universities in these fields increasingly lean in one direction, lean left, truth gets distorted and justice gets misunderstood. Let me note 3 harmful consequences in particular. First, students are often exposed to only one side of the story, or rather, they hear one side taught with rational authority by their professors and see the other only in the form of partisan political expression on the internet or Fox News. Sometimes legitimate research on the opposite side is indeed being done by well-trained scholars, but it's often in think tanks, institutions dedicated to research that often have a clear partisan identification which inevitably colors the results. And their publication outlets are independent of the academic mainstream. Their preferred products are policy proposals rather than scientific articles, and they don't write textbooks. Second, students and potential scholars of these subjects are, I think, sometimes discouraged by limited career prospects for those who don't adhere to the dominant opinion. They face, after all, permanent minority status in their fields should they succeed in even getting a job and getting published. And they'll watch most of the honors and emoluments of academic life go to others. Third, the whole process is self-reinforcing. If conservatives don't study sociology or history, sociologists and historians increasingly see only a part of the spectrum in their fields and themselves lose sight of the viability of alternatives, particularly when the only alternatives they encounter are the crassly partisan ones. Students of conservative inclination can sense something is wrong, but they struggle to find examples or even arguments to deepen and defend their views, often facing patronizing professors or their own nagging doubts. Of course, there are exceptions, even fields like medieval history, where conservatives are gathering and doing creative work. But the overall trend seems to me undeniable. At the very least, the conservative side of the spectrum, at many, if not most universities, is weak and faded, and the left side is vibrant and invincible. Why were we surprised when the students at my alma mater, Middlebury, shouted down a conservative speaker who came to campus? There were only a few conservatives on the faculty there. And from my perspective as an alumnus, the administration indicates by what they promise and praise that conservatives would be welcomed as part of that community only grudgingly, if at all. Aren't the students naturally going to see someone like Charles Murray as an alien, bright orange in a field of greens and blues, even without their professors, who ought to know better, egging them on? Is there anything that can be done to restore the full spectrum of intellectual life in the universities? One idea that's been pursued is the founding of alternative institutions, where conservative rather than liberal values are enshrined into the purpose of the place, and faculty are hired and students recruited accordingly. There's some good achieved this way, especially when the foundation is not political conservatism, but something more transcendental, perhaps necessarily a religious denomination of church. After all, many of our oldest universities and most of our colleges began as religious seminaries, giving them a dignity beyond mere usefulness. Still, this rather leavens the academic world taken as a whole than addresses the problem of it. For faculty at such schools cannot, and would not want to if they're good and genuine, enter into an alternative scholarly universe. They will and should be at conferences with the rest of us, publish in the same journals and at the same presses, and have one another's books in their libraries. The think tanks also have been helpful sponsors of research, supporting important, sometimes even transformative scholars whose work most likely would have been crushed in the university. Today, the major universities sometimes appear to be troops of foot soldiers for the Enlightenment, but most of all the major Enlightenment thinkers back in the 18th century, before Adam Smith and Immanuel Kant, were university trained, but did their important work outside of the precincts of the universities, then operating under the patronage and control of the church. Finally, a number of private foundations have been instrumental in promoting intellectual diversity on campus and in helping with career development of scholars who are not in the dominant mainstream. and some of them are our sponsors. Now, I remain confident, however, that thanks to these outside products and to the generally open and mixed system of funding research and higher education in America, genuine change within the universities is possible. And in some schools, I think it's already beginning. For one thing, although there are ideologues of both liberal and conservative inclination, there are very fine scholars on both sides, too, who do exchange ideas and read and criticize one another's work. I have two suggestions for how the process of tenure and promotion might be altered to facilitate such exchange. First, I think the emphasis on the sheer volume of scholarly production, with only secondary regard for its quality, encourages the narrowing of perspective, as well as the much-noted trend towards obscure specialization. Scholars who never read except to write a footnote are not the kind of people who make time to consider deeply the arguments on the other side. Whether the other side is the other side of the political spectrum or the other side of their own department, where colleagues take a different methodological approach. It's easier to count than to judge and discern, but my first suggestion is the restoration of the norm that colleagues read one another's work. Of course, as Madison wrote in another context, the effect might be inverted. What passes for judgment, even or especially in literary criticism these days, is often political pontificating. And many a conservative scholar has gotten himself tenure by getting enough published that his colleagues can't find an excuse to knock him down. Hence my second proposal, that no scholarly portfolio be considered complete unless there is some element of cross-disciplinary or interdisciplinary or collaborative work across fields within it, whether published or unpublished. A worthy faculty member has an inquiring mind, and while it's probably impossible to find an adequate measure of this, we need to be cautious of privileging measures that positively militate against thoughtfulness. So the case for freedom of speech, as I conclude, is not just a case for respecting the proper limits on licentious speech, or the case for protecting wide freedom for exchange within those limits. It's also the case for encouraging wide-ranging reflection and sustained inquiry into learning in all its dimensions. It requires an appreciation for the vastness of what can be known, humility in respect to how little each one of us can know, and curiosity to know more and to know better. How pitiful, then, that some students at my alma mater, now my fellow alumni, given the privilege of a few years of study, couldn't see the world in all the colors of the spectrum. Taught to view it only through the politics of identity, they overlook that college is about learning to see through the limits of identity, to encounter, especially through books, minds very different from one's own, and in a good curriculum, of great variety over time and space, and yes, ethnicity and ideology and faith. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote movingly in his beautiful book on the souls of Blackfoot, how in reading Shakespeare and other great writers, he could dwell, as he put it, quote, above the veil of color that otherwise would have oppressed him in segregated America. I suppose it would be misinterpreted to accuse contemporary academics and the students they indoctrinate of hiding behind a veil. But I do think that the question of freedom of speech, considered in its full meaning, requires us to rise above not only our prejudices, but our theories, and not only our backgrounds, but our cohorts. This is the true task of the university. And while I don't believe that that alone will adequately address the deep fractures in our political life, I do think that universities so dedicated will help produce the men and women who can. Thank you.
If our panelists would take their place up here while they're doing that. Now is the time for you, if you've developed questions in your mind, to fine-tune those questions, write them down if necessary, put them on your phone. And here in a few seconds, this microphone will be sent around and catch this man in the purple shirt's attention and allow you to talk. So right here, this one right here. So. As we're getting ready to go here, I wanted to call attention to the fact that this particular event was sponsored by the Political Science Department and co-sponsored by the Department of Philosophy. It was also generously funded by the Jack C. Miller Center and partially funded by the Happy Summers Foundation. So we're very thankful for that sort of funding. And if you're leaving, please be quiet and
Scan out, please.
please scan out as you're doing that. And be polite to everybody here. Please, 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 please. We have on the panel here today 5 professors who are going to question, challenge, make comments about what Dr. Stoner had to say. Why don't we bring you out here and sit out here. And I've implored them to keep their comments quick and short. They're not asking for 5 more speeches. But as this goes on, I want to get you involved in the questioning and answers as well. We have here on the panel, from over here on your far right, Dr. Bishop from History. We have Dr. DeHart from Political Science. We have Dr. Hernandez, also from Political Science. We have Dr. Bolsley from Philosophy. And Dr. Joanne Carson, also from Philosophy. So as you can see, in response to one of his calls here, an interdisciplinary approach, be it within this college, but an interdisciplinary approach to how we're going to approach these things. The first person I call on to make his remarks, actually not long ago, was on the opposite side of this. He was actually a dissertation student of Dr. Stoner, and Dr. Stoner's signature is on his dissertation. But now he needs to turn the tables a little bit and do the questions. So Dr. Hernandez.
Thank you, Dr. Stoner, for that talk. We appreciate it, and I do appreciate you signing that dissertation. And you can't take it back. How much did you pay? So, I think you make an argument about the good of free speech, rightly understood, meaning it has limits. You say that there are purposes to free speech, the free exchange of ideas that help us get to the truth. It helps us make decisions in a republic and allows us to express ourselves. One thing I was wondering about, and I think I've come to this position thinking about your talk, you can't do all 3 of those at once. It seems to me if we have to be somewhat inhibited in our speech, then you can't express yourself. Right? And if you're trying to express yourself, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to persuade other people. In a certain sense, the second one, trying to persuade people in a republic, requires you to conform somewhat to be able to persuade that person. Also, it's Constitution Day. And I was wondering about your talk and the Constitution, particularly this. Some of our framers didn't want us to have a Bill of Rights. Right? In the Federalist Papers, Hamilton and Madison, and certain points, particularly Hamilton, I guess, speak out against having a Bill of Rights for a number of reasons. Right? It might undermine the idea of express powers. They might miss a liberty. Right? But you said in your talk, well, one of the good things about our system of government is we can handle these things on different levels. So it's possible, well, state governments, before we had a bill of, even with the First Amendment, which didn't originally apply to the national government, state governments could have handled things like sorting out what constitutes free speech. But now the First Amendment applies to the states through the 14th Amendment. And I wonder, can we still work out free speech on this national level, which is how we have to do it now? So also, to some degree, I guess I'm wondering about this question. If some of the framers didn't want us to have a Bill of Rights, and then none of the framers wanted the Bill of Rights to apply against the states, is there an original intent of our framers with regard to the First Amendment? Can we still capture one? Second, it seems to me, and I think most people would agree, there are no absolute rights. Right? There are limits to all rights, but freedom of speech is a vague term. It has to be defined, and in your talk, you give some limits. But other people would have other limits, right? Other people would say encouraging people to dodge the draft doesn't constitute free speech. Or burning the American flag, or waving a Confederate flag might be on the verge of fighting words. Where are those best sorted out with regards to the limits of free speech? In a certain sense, my inclination would be, well, state legislatures, because that would reflect the community. But that would also mean that minority voices would be more likely to be, if it's going to be done through a legislature, who's going to stand up for minority rights? If it's going to be done through a court, well, what happened to the majority? Right? So who should decide where the limits of free speech are? And other than that, I'd just like to say I appreciate your commitment to the diversity of ideas as a good for citizens and a good for the university.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Now, one of the advantages that Dr. Stoner has as being our invited guest is after you've all kind of posted, he can choose which ones he's going to answer, so he doesn't have to be on the spot for every single thing here. So let's move to the Department of Philosophy here, to a very wonderful woman who I met quite serendipitously in another meeting, and we realized that we had some commonalities here. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Joanne Carson. Do you have some comments?
Probably not, if I just speak in my normal loud voice. So thank you, Dr. Stoner, for your astute and insightful diagnosis of our current crisis in free speech and political discourse in general. I'm especially appreciative of your remarks defending rational discourse. And I believe that that the notion of rationality is closely tied to the notion of free speech. The Constitution is a legal document, the supreme law of the land, and including the Bill of Rights, which came along a couple of years later. But the First Amendment is special because it embodies this notion of speech, which is very closely connected to thought and reason and imagination and creativity, which are really sort of moral notions about what it means to be a human being. And that always involves rational discourse. And if I was listening correctly, I think that the limitations that you just said were justified on free speech are often connected to the idea that in some sense rationality is undermined by certain forms of speech that might be irrational. So I just want to say I think it's rather ironic that this undermining of rational discourse has come to a large extent from within the academy. I mean, you mentioned some comments that Marcuse made some time back, but even more recently, we have some neuroscientists that are claiming that consciousness and rational deliberation are really just kind of epiphenomenal fluff. They really don't have any causal efficacy. I'm talking about the Libet experiments, you know, the famous Stanford prison experiment that suggests that people are really governed by unconscious urges and drives. And more recently, Jonathan Haidt, psychologist who has a chapter in his book, The Righteous Mind, called The Rational Delusion. The idea that rationality is really the tail wagging the dog. So, you know, there's also some other critical theorists, some postmodernists, deconstructionists. I don't want to lump everybody into that category, but there have been strains of undermining rational discourse within the university itself, which makes, you know, you want to ask if this crisis of free speech might be kind of a self-inflicted wound to some extent. But really my question is, and although I heard allusions to this throughout your talk, I would just really like to hear you go into a little bit more detail about the moral underpinnings of free speech and its connection to rationality and what it is to be a human being.
Thank you. year, we're going to move to the history department. Over there on the far end, Dr. Elizabeth Bishop, you have some thoughts and comments to offer?
I do. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes.
Superb. But first I'd like to express my gratitude first to all of you for bringing us here. This is a wonderful conversation. And secondly to my colleague, Dr. Shannon Duffy. Although her training is, of course, as you know, in the history of the early American Republic, she, however, asked me to take her place. My specialization is Arab history of the 1950s. So I hope to offer some of the diversity that we have in the history department to this conversation. Thank you for making it possible. The question I'd like to ask, please, is I would like to take you up in this entire rich presentation on one of the moments in which I felt you were speaking almost historically. And that's when you referred to the enemies of the day, as if in different periods of time these enemies may differ. You drew our attention to Isaiah Berlin, and when you described him in distinctly personal terms. You called him a skeptic, and you called him ironic. And I'm wondering if some of the terms you chose to describe him would also describe the times in which he lived. So, for example, your reference to negative freedom of speech might very well describe the 1940 Smith Act, or, of course, you mentioned the W.B. Du Bois without acknowledging that, for example, his passport had been taken. Until 1957, he was not permitted international travel for, I believe you would agree, political reasons. Excellent. And then with regard to positive freedoms of speech, from my own area of expertise, I would refer to the technical aspects of the Baghdad Pact the Baghdad Pact diplomatic agreement that in its technical provisions placed great emphasis on what it called counter-subversion. If you would address these skeptical or ironic aspects of a particular age, in the light of the age in which we live now, I would very much appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now moving back to the Department of Philosophy, Professor who I have to admit I have not had a chance to meet personally, so I'm thrilled that you're here. He was invited specifically, asked to be invited specifically by Dr. Carson, and how am I going to refuse her? But Dr. Balsnick, do you have some comments for me?
I probably have too many, but I will try to make them brief. I will do something I don't like to do and don't often do, which is to read my remarks, at least in part, because time is short and I've tried to condense my comments. Let me also begin by saying I'm honored to be on the panel, so thank you for your remarks, and thanks everyone for having me and for coming. This is a rich talk with lots of things worth considering. However, I'd like to focus my short time today on an idea that may be latent in Dr. Stoner's talk, but which is not considered explicitly. More specifically, there are three more or less independent elements of his argument that, when considered in conjunction, suggest, at least to me, a provocative and intriguing thesis, and I'd like to get Dr. Stoner's reaction to this thesis. So the first element I have in mind here is his approving invocation of our adversarial justice system. Early in the lecture, Dr. Stoner mentioned that, quote, trials in courts depend on an adversarial system in which advocates on both sides of the dispute take turns. For those unfamiliar with this expression or the institution to which it refers, it's worth taking just a second to make sure we're clear on this. What do we mean by the adversarial system of justice? Well, here's an anecdote that some of you may be familiar with, especially if you know many lawyers, or that you may become familiar with, and it illustrates it nicely. If you know anyone who spent any time working in a public defender's office, they'll tell you that they inevitably get the question, some version of the question, right? Namely, how do you do it? How do you defend these, these people who do these things, especially when they tell you that they did it, right? And what's the answer? The answer is always some version of, because I believe in the adversarial system of justice. Here's how our judicial system works. The lawyers for the prosecution go to the mat for the prosecution. The lawyers for the defense go to the mat for the defense, right? Within the ground rules, of course. You can't tamper with evidence, you can't suppress evidence, you can't lie in oath. But within the ground rules, both parties go to the mat, and we're confident that more often than not, the truth will arise. Right? So that's the adversarial system of justice. Dr. Stoner, rightly, I think, invokes it approvingly. The second element of his talk I want to highlight is this. I think he's working with a tacit, when he's invoking the Berlinian language of the positive liberty of speech, I think he's working with something like the following distinction. On the one hand, there's a right to freely speak, or to speak freely, that is devoid of the threat of undue censorship. But then on the other hand, there's the right of free access to speech, right? The right to freely hear or encounter other people's speech. Now, maybe I think he's saying this because I misunderstood his remarks and he can disabuse me of this. But if I have this interpretation, it's because I can't hear the invocation of Berlin's distinction between negative and positive liberty without thinking of negative and positive rights more generally. And again, not enough time to go into it, but just very briefly, a negative right is one I honor simply by not doing something to you, hence it's a negative right. So it's not, again, with Berlin's distinction, it's not as if one is good and one is bad. A negative right is one I fulfill simply by not doing you. So the right to life, paradigmatically, is a negative right. I honor it simply by not killing you. Okay? A positive right, by contrast, is one that somebody, to honor, you would have to, as it were, positively do something for me. Right? Children, we think, have positive rights to the aid and care and love of their parents. Going back to my first little element, the right to a fair trial is a positive right. If the accused has a right to a fair and speedy trial, then somebody or something has a positive duty to provide that for the accused. Okay? So I think what Dr. Stoner, we can plausibly read him at least, is calling our attention to the fact that free speech has both these components, right? The right to speak freely and the right to speech, the right to hear or to access the full range of relevant speech, right? And this latter right has sort of a positive element, right? If there are people of whom we can truly say they have a right to the full range and access to the full range of relevant speech, then there must be someone or something that has the positive duty to supply that right. Now, perhaps Dr. Stoner may object that I've misinterpreted him here, and that, quote unquote, to use my terms, a right to freely access the full range of relevant speech is not what he has in mind by the Berlinian notion of positive liberty of speech. But he hasn't quite told us what he does mean, and I know of no other way to really read quotes like the following, quote, our crisis in free speech today is, ... that we fail to summon and encourage the speech we really need. And that this is the notion he's working with, I think, is further evidenced by the third element I want to quickly call attention to. And that is his approving invocation of, to use Jonathan Haidt's phrase, the heterodox academy. Right? He mentioned, he didn't mention any by name, but he mentioned institutions. I think probably has in mind things like the Templeton Foundation, and I'll mention another one, the Institute for Humane Studies. In full disclosure, during my doctoral research, I benefited from support from the Institute for Humane Studies. But these institutions, Dr. Stoner mentioned as sort of championing what Jonathan Haidt calls the heterodox academy, a deliberate effort to infuse or at least encourage some ideological diversity into the academy. Okay, so I'm almost done, I promise. Putting these three elements together, the approving invocation of our adversarial legal system, the notion of something like a positive right to freely access the full range of relevant speech, and the approving description of the heterodox academy, the question I have for Dr. Stoner is whether he sort of would take all those theological conclusions and advocate that we reconceive here I'll use a metaphor, the courts of public opinion on the same adversarial model as we used to understand the court of law. That is, would we not do better to regard the major institutions of the court of public opinion, and here I have in mind principally the media and the academy, including even the natural sciences, would we not do better to regard those institutions as we regard the prosecution and defense in the court of law? Would we not extend the same sorts of expectations to them? So expressed as provocatively as I can muster, the proponent of the adversarial model of the court of public opinion might say this: let Exxon and BP fund their studies, let the Sierra Club and the World Resources Institute fund their studies. We know that both parties have stakes and interests and probably biases, right? Everybody does. Let everybody do it, let nobody, what's the word I'm looking for? Occlude their biases, and then let the court of public opinion, as it were, judge the results. Right? So now, just in closing, I'll say I'm not offering this as an accusation or as a challenge to Dr. Stoner's reasoning or as an attempted reductio on his premises, but as a genuine inquiry as to how we might receive the suggestion that we would do well to happily and heartily adversarialize the media in the academy. At the very least, it seems like it might be a positive step in the direction of the positive liberty of speech. Way over time, I apologize.
Thank you. Thank you. Finally, and I chose him specifically without telling him that I wanted him to be the last one, because he's become in our department my favorite political theorist. He and I both claimed the University of Texas for our final degrees, and we know a lot of common there. But Dr. Paul DeHart, what do you have to say to us today?
I just came for the extra credit. Also, had I been told the president and the provost were coming, I would have put on a jacket and a tie instead of these Socratic rags. Setting all that aside, I agree with Dr. Stoner's thinking about liberty of speech and liberty in general in terms of the purposes of liberty, or the purposes of speech, and the notion that there might be moral limits and on the exercise of speech, as well as limits in terms of civility. I also agree with the distinction between liberty of speech and licentiousness. Of course, John Locke subscribed to that distinction. He didn't think liberty was intelligible or comprehensible without the distinction between liberty and license. All that said, I'd like to run just a little bit of an argument, mostly just for fun, from the notion of purposes of speech on behalf of negative liberty of speech, perhaps. So, I agree that freedom of speech, for instance, is not an end in itself, but rather a means to an end, or to multiple ends. And so it ought to be construed and framed in terms of those ends. Among those ends, then, he mentions self-government. And I'd like to use another turn of phrase for self-government, popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty refers not primarily to a kind of state that is sovereign over society, such as a democratic one. Rather, popular sovereignty refers first and foremost to the sovereignty of society over government, as well as individuals, though society sovereignty over individuals is usually exercised by government. Popular sovereignty refers to the supremacy of the people within the political system as a whole. If free speech is for the sake of Republican small r or Democratic small d self-government, then it is for the sake of the people exercising sovereignty over government. It is for the sake of informed popular accountability. Now, on behalf of negative liberty of speech, building from one of Professor Stoner's essential functions, again, or one of the goods free speech seeks to serve, we might say this: popular sovereignty is undone if the government can regulate or regulate much the means by which popular sovereignty is exercised. Thus, if free speech allows for limits strongly enforceable by government, we might run the risk of undoing popular sovereignty over government, one of the central goods free speech itself is supposed to serve. Now, I could build that out a little bit farther, but I think the time is short. And I won't be on saying that it seems that free speech, together with freedom of the press, which meant not primarily, would of course cover the freedom of the journalistic class, but it didn't refer to the media, it referred to the freedom of the printing press, publishing primarily. We might view these, freedom of speech, freedom of press, other liberties in the First Amendment as constitutive of the sort of open public realm, necessary for popular sovereignty to be exercised, for popular opinion to form, and finally to be brought to bear. But in that case, we risk flipping the thing on its head if we allow government too much role in enforcing limits on speech.
Thank you very much. Now, before I give Dr. Stoner a chance to decide which of those questions he's actually going to answer, which he has the freedom to deal with that, that's his privilege. But you be thinking about your questions, but Dr. DeHart called to my attention something that I had forgotten to do at the beginning, even though it was written down on my little notes. I want to thank the president and the provost of the university for attending here today, and so we're honored to have you here, and thank you. So, Dr. Stoner, is there something you want to answer?
Let me see if I can say one sentence to each, so we leave time for the audience. For Dr. Hernandez, I appreciate the mention of the states, and although I think that the founding fathers supposed that the states also favored freedom of speech, generally. I think it's a problem today insofar as we look to the courts to lead us in an understanding of freedom of speech. But I think the issue is much bigger than the courts. The courts only draw the outer limit of freedom of speech and the real challenge of free speech, as I tried to convey it, especially in my remarks about the university, is for all of us in whatever institutions we're involved with, from the family, through our churches, through other community organizations we're a member of, and the university, to work to promote, but also understand the proper form of free speech in each of those places. And that's a real responsibility for us. It's not something that we should devolve upon the court. And so we should have the right to speak back to the court. I think actually we do have that right, and that's an important one. To Dr. Carson, I appreciate you quite rightly point out that I was speaking and presumed human rationality as the sort of defining function of the human being, and therefore as central to understanding free speech. What is the free speech appropriate of a rational for a rational being? But of course, we're rational animals as well as rational beings, and so it's characteristic of human beings that we're both rational and irrational. And free speech is sometimes a matter of giving a little room for irrationality. Hence the protest, right? Hence the expression of an opinion with passion or the use of rhetoric, which is not simply rational speech, right? If the only thing that mattered were rationality, then I think Plato has it right, and maybe you agree, that the philosophers should rule. But ours is a democracy, and I think maybe rightly so, a democracy, and that's to account for the fact that we find no one who is perfectly rational, except maybe, present company may be excluded, and also no one who is fully irrational, and that it's dealing with that middle, which is where our political challenges are to be found. For Dr. Bishop, I appreciate the challenge in that it was a very succinct remark, but very pointed and really very serious, I think. I don't remember the details of the Baghdad Pact, but I think what you were raising, because I never took your course, I'm sorry, but because as you explained it, I'm sure you taught it, but as I understand it, in a way what you're getting at is the question of both whether in different ages Americans weren't much more intolerant of a variety of speech, and whether we promoted that in some other places in the world, and maybe even some other places have or should have different attitudes towards free speech. I'm not sure where you mean to go with that, whether that's to say that that's a problem or that that's a good thing. I guess my own thinking is to say that what I was speaking about is really meant for us and now, for America in our time. And that it is true that different kinds of societies might understand freedom of speech a little differently, and that in different times and places, even in the United States, we had to fear the overthrow of our government more than we presently do. Or maybe now we actually have to fear it more than we have in the recent years. That I think is maybe the most challenging question for us today. There's the book I mentioned, Timothy Garden-Ash's book on freedom of speech, is really fine on this question, because he says, so many of our issues of freedom of speech now have to do with the internet. And of course, the internet destroys the question of different places, or almost destroys it. There are some countries which have their own sort of great wall between the world internet and their internet. So China, Iran, Russia, I think. Others have tried. I'm not sure if anyone else has been successful at it. And in some ways, the internet was an American creation, to be sure, and was a way of promoting American doctrines of free speech. And Garden-Ash is willing to say, as a matter of norm, even if not a matter of law, the American solution is a pretty good one. It's in a way the obverse of Dr. Hernandez's question about what about working this out locally? I think there are local places to work it out, but it's also true that the meaning of that globally is problematic, I guess, in the age of the internet. But I think unless we always see the world online in terms of the world, the physical world in which we actually live, I think we'll misunderstand it. And there's some tendency today, right, to see the physical world in which we live, it's sort of like the movie The Matrix, as a kind of reverse of virtual reality, which is the real reality. And so that's the best I can do, I think, for your response. And please come back later if we can, if I didn't understand you, or if you think we really ought to pursue that more. I like the question about positive liberty, and to clarify that for Dr. Bolsey, I guess I would say, in a way, you caught what I was getting at, which is that there are two kinds of positive liberty in my talk. The first being what Berlin would call positive liberty, which I think he doesn't really mean as something positive at all, but really as the use of the term liberty to promote a kind of repression. And that I don't mean to endorse, even though I think it's something we ought to sense as a real sort of tendency, maybe in every view of liberty, that it can sort of ironically become oppressive, even when it's promoting freedom or thinks it's promoting freedom. But as for that second, positive liberty as something like the adversarial system, I agree more or less with regard to the public sphere, where I think that adversity is what brings us towards the good. And yet, there, and certainly within the academy, where I think there are maybe different rules of engagement, because after all, there's only one tenure committee. It can't be that more of our team than your team on the committee, you get tenure, right? You pick the right team, you get tenure, right? As opposed to meeting some criteria that have some sort of status that transcends particular difference, whether it's partisan or methodological or the like. So I think that, again, you have to, and then we can be aware of different settings in this way. And that what's set in the court is not necessarily true for the polity, although it's not a bad model for the polity. And it's true only in certain respects, but not in the end in the academy. Because in both the polity and the academy, we need to seek a common good too. It's not just enough to have full adversity and just assume that some invisible hand is going to make everything work out at the end. And that last point leads me to Dr. DeHart's point. I think I really do agree. I really liked his phrase that freedom can be undone if the government can regulate the means by which it is exercised. And thereby, I think there really is, I'm not sure I was supposing that. Since many of the limits I was talking about would be limits within communities and maybe imposed by norms rather than by rule, but he does allow me to make a further point, which is if he wants to make that a criticism, say, of certain kinds of rules that purport to be fair about hearing both sides, such as campaign finance laws, I think I agree with him that it really is better to leave things open, because the problem with the kind of tightly refereed system is that the referee actually is determining what are the two sides. And political life has a kind of openness where we can't always be sure what the two sides are. And one side might suddenly morph into something different. If you don't believe me, ask all the never-Trump Republicans what party they belong to now. Or actually maybe ask Mr. Trump what party he belongs to now. We'll see what next week brings on that score.
All right, thank you. We have a microphone right here, and I think there's some people that have some questions that they'd like to ask. Everybody up here is fair game for questions. Please go ahead.
Okay, I just want to say thank you, Doctor, for sharing your insight with us. Tonight I've been convinced on the need to limit speech in order to enable it.
Okay,
But let us see if we can discover some more of these useful limits. The news media has, in my opinion, lost its integrity. They take speeches out of context, they frame speech, they omit key details, they sensationalize, and ultimately manipulate the truth to suit their political or business interests. to the point where the people don't trust them, and as a result, do not know where to turn for correct information. When confronted, they often use the First Amendment to justify themselves. How can we limit this disinformation, or should we just allow this to continue because technically they are within their rights? Thank you.
Right, well, thank you, and thank you for pointing out that I did go a little over my own time, and I apologize for that. And for pointing out so graciously. With regard to the news media, I think that if you look back over American history, you'll find that the press has very often been a very partisan press. The notion that there could be an objective press, a professional press that everybody could trust, I think was an artifact of mid-20th century America. It grew out of the progressive movement. And there's been some advance in seeing that that's been exploded. At the same time, and I agree with you, that the press, the members of the press typically have come to their task, especially in recent years, it seems, with sort of decided partisan opinions. I don't know they're all of the same party. So again, I think that my suggestion of kind of, in the absence of objectivity, a kind of bipartisanship, even as a kind of rule of thumb, right? To recognize that it's important to have people who see it different ways and to have editors. I mean, maybe on the editorial staff. You know, it's really a question of which, I think that there's obviously a real market. I agree with you. There's a real market for a press where you can really trust the facts. And not just that says it's trustworthy or all the news that's fit to print or fair and balanced. I mean, just the slogans aren't convincing people anymore. But I think the product could be there. I think there's some people working on it. To figure out how to present it is a real challenge. And maybe I could say it's a kind of challenge for your generation to put together a media, or to at least some outlets of the media that succeed in that way. Now, it's also true that if you listen to the other media, so to speak, if you listen to both Fox and CNN, for example, or NPR and something else, you will get different perspectives on things. And reading, you know, someone suggested it's really important to read earlier today, to read as well as just to listen. And I think that's really true. Usually when you read an article, especially something extended, in one of the better journals of opinion, you know, whether it's commentary on the one hand or The Nation on the far other hand, or the American Prospect, or some of the new journals like National Affairs or American Affairs that have appeared on the right, you're going to see really extended arguments on certain policies. And that digging deeper than what can be conveyed on a single screen, right? Going beyond the bullet points. Even, God forbid, taking a course, you know, in which you're reading longer things. That really is essential to learning. And I guess a good start is to stop glorifying the zingers, the one-liners, the tweets, and to realize that they have their amusement, but serious thought takes time and has nuance and requires work.
I also just wanted to thank the doctors for being here today to engage in this wonderful discourse that we had today. I wanted to touch kind of on what Dr. DiD discussed about informed accountability for citizens. Dr. Stoner just kind of touched on it, but in the idea of diversity today, I'd like to show this question to the panelists more than Dr. Stoner. As students and as citizens and as members of academia, Dr. Stoner talked about that we need to seek diversity in what we see in both, not only partisanship, but just in ideas in general. So how do you suggest that students find free speech to ingest without partisanship within your academic sections?
Somebody want to jump on that right away? He was kind of aiming at Dr. Hart.
It's never good. So, I think that Professor Stone probably already touched on this. You should read and listen broadly, and you should
take courses with, and read and pay attention to people you might, that you might disagree with, or that you suspect you disagree with. I've always been a fan, and it's probably boring, of what's called scholastic method. In scholastic method, one of the things that you would do is to frame the objections to a position, and then state the position, and then you would state the alternative. In the course of this, somebody like Thomas Aquinas in the medieval period would often state the objection to the position that he disagreed with so well that sometimes folks wonder if he really overcame it on the other side. And Plato is said to have stated the objection, the primary objection in Book 3 of the Republic to his account of justice so well. The question is, did he actually answer? So I think you want to approach things where you say, not who are the buffoons on the other side, who are the people making the silly arguments, or who are the people screaming the loudest, but not that every position is fully legitimate, but who on the other side is making a smart argument, and what's the best construction, the strongest version of the argument that they have to offer, and then who makes good and strong arguments in reply. I usually tell my students in class that you haven't met or defeated the argument unless you've responded to the strongest argument the other side has to offer first. And that requires careful listening. It requires, for the most part, a deep ability to sympathize with positions that you might ultimately reject.
We are out of our formal time. Hang on, don't jump up quite yet. Give me another 2 minutes, please. But first, let's thank everyone up here for their time. Event of not just the Discourse of Democracy, but Constitution Day, Constitution Week. There are many other events on campus this week. Please look around for some of those. One that I was implored by our colleagues in the Department of Philosophy to advertise right now, and it's a little bit of shameless self-promotion here. Tomorrow afternoon at 4:30 in the San Marcos Public Library, I'll be giving a talk on the military and absentee voting as part of one of those rights of citizenship, or how that's been handled. So you're welcome to come on to the event. I don't know if there's any free food or not, but there is free food. So come on down, we'll see you there. So again, thank you very much for attending. Please spread the word about the Discourse and Constitution Week, and we thank you very much.